new decade, mapping the megatrends, being held at Panaji, Goa. It is a mark of our undying tradition to invoke the Almighty at the beginning of any important event. Like a great philosopher once said, the function of prayer is not to influence God, but rather to change the nature of one who prays. I would request the technical team to play the AV of the invocation and lighting of the lamp.
Asadoma Satgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Mritangamaya Sarve Sukhinah Santu Sarve Santu Niramaya Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschit Dukkha Bhat Bhavet.
Thank you, technical team. I am indeed honored to be delivering the welcome address for today's evening. On behalf of PRCI and WCC, I extend a very warm welcome to everyone for this last session on the 15th Global Communication Conclave, an international webinar on communication in the new decade, mapping the megatrends. This being the centenary year of media education in the country, makes it more apt to look at the megatrends in communication and would make up the core of communication, media, and media education for the future. We have all come here together here today to honor and celebrate this journey as the torchbearers of communication. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome all the dignitaries who have virtually and physically joined us here today. Firstly, to initiate the discussion and enlighten us on the megatrends in communication, we have amongst us a list of distinguished speakers. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of them. Professor Daya Thussu, Professor, International Communication from the School of Communication, Hong Kong Baptist University, Hong Kong. It is indeed our honor, sir, to have you amongst us. We are all eagerly awaiting to listen to your talk. Ms. Kubashini Rama, Executive Director, Gender Links, Cyrildene, Johannesburg, South Africa. I welcome you, ma'am. And Dr. Laxman Datt Pant, Chairperson, Media Action, Nepal. A very warm welcome to you, sir. We are all honored to have you with us today. I extend a very warm welcome to our chairperson for this session and this evening, Dr. B.K. Ravi, Professor and Chairman at the Department of Communication, Bangalore University, Bangalore. Welcome to you, sir.
Thank you.
I would also take this opportunity to welcome all the members who have been instrumental in conceptualizing and executing this international conclave. Mr. M.B. Jairam, Chairman Emeritus and Chief Mentor of PRCI. Mr. B. Srinivas Murthy, Chairman of the Global Conclave. Ms. Geeta Shankar, Director YCC Board. Mr. Biswajit Das, Secretary General of WCC. And Dr. T. Vinay Kumar, National President of PRCI. Lastly, I would like to extend a very, very warm welcome to all the invitees, members, media and PR professionals, research scholars, academicians, faculty members from various universities, and students who have taken the time off to join us here for the session today. I again welcome all of you for a great evening filled with a fruitful deliberation. Thank you all. Just a note before we begin this session, we will take questions at the end of the session. So request all the participants who are attending the session to please leave their questions in the chat box and we will try our best to answer as many as possible. So without any further delays, I would like to first request our chairperson, Dr. B.K. Ravi, to officially begin the session. But before sir begins, here is a brief bio of sir. Dr. B.K. Ravi is a professor and chairman, Department of Communication, Bangalore University, Nyambarti campus. He has 31 years of teaching experience and research experience. During his academic tenure, he has presented research papers in India and abroad, including the United States of America, Poland, Japan, Morocco, New Zealand, Kenya, Qatar, Thailand, Malaysia, Canada, and China. He has published articles in many reputed international research journals, guided more than 10 students for their doctoral studies, and has also adjudicated many theses for national and international universities. He has chaired nearly 14 scientific sessions at international conferences in different countries. He was the member of the editorial advisory board of an internationally acclaimed book entitled Engaging Terrorism Oxygen for Media Airwaves, An Age of Terrorodia. Since Sir is the Vice President of All India Communication and Media Association, New Delhi, member Media Action Nepal, Kathmandu, and an organization to promote freedom of expression and media development, and also a member of the advisory board International Journalist Coalition, USA, a global organization for welfare of journalists. And it doesn't stop here. Sir has many more accolades to his name. Sir is a huge pillar of strength and support to his students, and someone who constantly encourages and motivates all of us and pushes us to achieve bigger. Thank you, sir. Sir, I request you to please begin the session with your introductory remarks.
Namaste. Good evening to everybody. Greetings from Public Relations Council of India. It's a great honor to me to preside over this session because three eminent internationally renowned scholars have joined us. Public Relations Council of India is the amalgamation of academicians, professionals, and researchers, where we are striving very hard to train our younger generation to the field of media industry. And we don't not only concentrate on public relations and corporate communication, we are also looking into in terms of training them regarding their preparation to the advertisement sector and other requirements of media. And Public Relations Council of India, we also help our basically not only our media students, management students, law students, students from social sciences background, to learn about media and the functioning of media. And I think Laxman, I think he's the chairman World Communication Council from Nepal also. So basically, this is the 15th global conclave we are organizing throughout the country, throughout the world. We have different branches for Public Relations Council of India. So this now this global conference is held in Panaji, Goa, which is one of the very popular coastal cities of India, as all of you know. The last year and before last year, we had hosted in Bangalore. And because of COVID-19 in the middle, we couldn't organize one. And this time it was a very successful marathon conference that has happened since yesterday. The Honorable His Excellency, the Governor of Goa, he inaugurated, and the Honorable Chief Minister of Goa attended our function yesterday. Both the dignitaries and quite a lot of media professionals were there. So this is the 8th academic session we are organizing, and though we are linked with Zoom in the auditorium, all our fellow friends are listening to all of us, and it's a dual. One is live, and other one is we are connected virtually. It's a great honor. So basically, the concept of this year is communication in the new decade, mapping the mega trends. Since all the three, they are researchers and they work very hard regarding the functioning of media. Because I think I had to mention the contribution of Professor Daya, Thussu, Laxman, Datt, Pant, and Rama, especially Professor Daya, Thussu. He is an expert in international communication, and I think he has studied a lot. Even Laxman is working very hard to bring quite a lot of changes in the functioning of media. And even Rama, she's also an excellent researcher and she's an authority. So basically, what exactly has happened and what has happened in the last some decades, and including the COVID-19, as all of us know, the media industry, we have suffered quite a lot. And the emergence of digital technology, the emergence of OTT, what exactly, because my understanding so far as the emergence of is the process of communication. But my basic point is, are we in a position to reach? What is the percentage of messages that are exactly reached, and what may happen in the coming decade? Because it's a great challenge. See, emergence of OTT and the disappearance of a lot of newspapers and periodicals, and the whole, especially in Indian context, we have suffered a lot. And what exactly are we expecting from in the next new decade, and where exactly we started and where exactly we are going to end? These are some of the basic questions which needs to be answered. So I think our esteemed guests will definitely throw light on quite a lot of issues of this kind. I'm really proud and very happy. Once again, I'm very grateful and thankful to Professor Thussu, Mr. Laxman Pant, and Rama for accepting our invitation. And in spite of the busy schedule, they made it. So let us listen to all our distinguished guests. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Thank you, sir, for laying the foundation for the session and opening the floor up for deliberations. So our first speaker for this evening is Professor Daya. Sir is a professor of international communication at Hongkong Baptist University, Hong Kong. For the academic year 2018-2019, he was a visiting professor and inaugural Disney chair in global media at Schwarzman College, Taestung University in Beijing. Prior to that, for 14 years, he was a professor of international communication and the co-director of Indian Media Center, as well as the research advisor to the China Media Center at the University of Westminster in London. Author and editor of 19 books, including International Communication, Continuity and Change, 3rd edition. And he is the founder and managing editor of the journal Global Media and Communication. Sir, like I mentioned before, we are all eager to listen to you and your take on communication and its megatrends. Sir, the session's all yours.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mahadeva, and thank you, Professor Ravi, for inviting me to be part of this. I wish I had more time and attend the conclave from yesterday onwards, because it sounds very interesting. But it's a privilege to be part of this final session, and although the audience is small, but I'm hoping it's a committed audience, so we'll have an interesting conversation. I've got some slides to share, and I hope it works. Let me just okay. Can you see the slides?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So I titled it "Communication with an Asian Accent," because the title of the session is "Communication in the New Decade," which is just started. It's already first year of that decade. We're mapping the mega trends. So we're looking ahead, and as it was mentioned earlier that so much has changed in the world of communication in the last decade or 2 decades. Last decade, especially with digitization and mobile technology, that it's actually difficult to predict what will happen, because the speed of change is so incredibly fast. But there are certain trends that one could perhaps point to, and that's what I'll do in my limited time. And my focus is obviously on the digitization process and how that has transformed, especially large population countries in Asia. My focus would be on the two most, largest countries in terms of population, both China and India, and what is happening in the digital space in these two countries. And given the scale and scope of change that has already happened and is likely to happen in the coming decade, I think it's safe to say that internet is going to have a very strong, not just internet, but the whole digital space is going to have a very strong Asian accent. So, as I mentioned in my introduction about me, I have had the privilege to spend some time in China. I was there for a year, and that was a really very eye-opening experience, because I was fortunately based in the top university in China, and one could see firsthand what is happening there, not just in communication field, but more broadly in global studies, if you like, international relations, which is what my background, academic background is. So if we think about the internet, we obviously and understandably think about the United States. This is where the internet was conceived, was developed, and even today, its governance, its infrastructure, its commerce is still largely dominated by a very few companies based in the United States. So, for example, this is some information about the big five, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google, Apple, and Facebook. And their power is obviously enormous. They have so much cash to spare, they don't know what to do with it. Some of their revenues are bigger than the GDP of many countries in the world. If Facebook was a country, it would have the largest population on the planet. So we're talking about extremely powerful companies, as you see, essentially and exclusively based in the United States. And that's not surprising, because, as I said, it all started there, and the American imprint on the digital space is very well researched and documented. So although it was invented there, but the usage of internet has changed, and changed profoundly. When internet was being privatized in the early 1990s, 60% of people who used the internet were American citizens. Today, their figure is shrunk to one digit. Majority of people who are using the internet live in Asia. The largest internet is actually the Mandarin internet. So I did some data crunching, and this is, again, these things change every month because the scale is so massive. So this is slightly dated, but it will give you a sense of top internet users. Now China has gone into billion. They've already got it. They got into 4 figures. China, India, US, Indonesia, Brazil, Nigeria, Russia, Japan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. So it's January 2020. So it's it's 18 months old data. So you can imagine, as I said, in China's case, already gone for over 1 billion. But the interesting figure here is the second column, people not online. So if you look at the US, only 4% is not online. Japan, only 10% is not online. Pakistan, 59% not online. In our own country, 46%. Maybe it's come down because the change is so rapid. But still, a large proportion is not. Even in China, it's 1.4 billion people. If they've got into the billion figure, still there are a lot of many millions, hundreds of millions who are not connected. So the future is obviously going to be in these areas, the big population countries. And many of these are actually in Asia. And I'm focusing on the 2 big ones because they are complicated countries, because they're not just countries, they represent very distinctive political systems, cultures, civilizational ethos, etc. So if they dominate digital space, it has multiple implications. So India is again an amazing case study. In the last 2 decades, the growth of internet has been phenomenal. There's 5 million people online in 2000, and today it's crossed 700 million. And I called it the biggest open internet because the Chinese one, which is bigger than the Indian one, is not open. As we all know, it is very controlled. It is part of a very different kind of political system, an authoritarian one-party state, and internet is part of that system. So obviously there are structural limitations of how open it can be. But in India's case, the other major advantage that India has is demography. A large majority of Indians are very young. Although it's one of the oldest civilizations on the planet, as a country, it is relatively new. We only got formal independence in 1947. So if you look at the growth of mobile internet in India, it is already the second largest mobile market in the world after China. Also, very important for Facebook, because the biggest market in the world is in India for it, as is the case with WhatsApp, which is also owned by Facebook. And I put the title WhatsApp University because it's quite interesting how this connectivity is also being used for certain kind of educational aspect, and if the kind of material that circulates in these social media, and kind of whole debate about fake news, and is very worrying, because it is such a early kind of platform for a lot of people, a generation which has grown, many of them having had no experience of even literacy. So from very, very basic exposure to any kind of technology, we are moving on to this like TikTok kind of generation, 10-second video generation, and that creates its own sets of problems. But in terms of the access and what it offers is actually remarkably interesting for a developing country like us. Also significant in the last few years, I would say the last 5 years, has been the interesting convergence between a very pro-business government, unashamedly pro-business government, and India's corporate elite, which has recognized that digital spaces can be commodified, and there's a lot of money to be made. And one of the best example of that is obviously Jio, which has fundamentally transformed the internet in India, and is still very early stages. It was only set up in 2016. And look at this chart here, 2015, already operating in different types of electronic commerce, from business to retail to publishing to media to, and if you compare it with the big guys in the field, Amazon, for instance, and China's Alibaba, Jio is not doing badly. And it offers a very interesting kind of case of an open internet, which is, so Jio has very strong ties with both Google and Facebook. There is investment from these big companies in this company. But it also has a very strong kind of, if you like, nativist argument about Indian internet. We have to have an Indian internet. And that is something which, to me, looks very interesting in the future in terms of the future trends of, given the scale of the market and the size, there is a potential of creating an Indian internet, also having the platforms which are Indian. One of the great advantage is the cost. Mobile telephony, mobile communication is cheapest in India, in the world. And again, it's the scale, it's the same logic. The more people use it, the prices go down. And as most of you know, Jio has announced, and it's actually in production now, to produce the cheapest smartphone in the world. And if that happens, and given what the geopolitical situation is in relation to China, that could be a game changer. So not just for the massive Indian market, but actually much of the global south, much of the developing world. So that's an interesting space to think about. So amazing things are happening in Indian situation, but the reality is that the platforms that we're using, whether it's WhatsApp or Google or Amazon, they're all American platforms. And we are not unusual. That is how most of the world operates in the digital space. That digital space is essentially colonized by 5 or 6 very, very powerful companies. What distinguishes China from the rest of the world is that it has actually created its own platforms. So a few years ago, I produced a book. It's called China's Media Go Global, with a colleague in Beijing and a colleague in London, because, as was mentioned, I used to be involved with the China Media Center, and the director of that center was one of the editors of the book we published. And I used, in that, I have a small chapter in it, I used the phrase cyber capitalism with Chinese characteristics, that every major digital platform or property that you and I use, or much of the world uses, China has its own equivalent. No other country has managed that. France, Germany, Britain, Brazil, India, Russia. Russia to a certain extent, but very limited. So what I've argued in that piece was that precisely because it was a totally controlled system, the Chinese companies did not have to compete with the Google or Facebook, and as a result, they were able to produce their own. And now they're big enough to compete with the big guys. I think the Jio case is also interesting in the same way, because now it has got enough strength to actually take on the big guys. So, Chinese internet is already Chinese in terms of software, hardware, everything. And some of that is now also going abroad. So think of, for example, Alibaba and its investment in cloud computing. It's third only to Amazon and Microsoft, who are at a different level, obviously, for various reasons. Chinese presence also is very, very strong in the field of what is to come, which is the Internet of Things. 5G, there was so much controversy last year about that. And if you look at this, is the 5G, the patents linked to 5G, and the Chinese, the one in red, are at the top globally. In our own country, a vast majority of smartphones that we use are actually made in China. And given the political situation between the two countries, this is fraught with problems, including surveillance and data theft, etc. And 5G, obviously, China is ahead of many more advanced countries than us. In fact, those of you who've been to China would know the mobile payment system there is far more sophisticated than anything I've seen. I've lived in London for 30 years. You go to UK and you feel you come to a country which is a different level of development in this space. So something quite substantial has already happening. happened and is likely to continue because, as some of you may know, last year China launched a 6G satellite. So they're already talking about the 6th generation mobile. We're still at 4G, and of course, recent announcement by government to open up that space to private investment is very encouraging. But we'll see in India the pace of things are slightly different level. So what does this tell us about the future? I've just looked at a very limited area, which is this digital space. But there's a bigger story that we need to think about, maybe, which is that China already is actually the largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. In terms of total GDP, is the second largest economy. And India, despite what people think of it outside India, because we don't get a very good press. The Chinese also get a bad press, but for very different reasons. We were, since 2014, 15, I think, we were already third largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. And if COVID had not hit India the way it hit us, it already got the total GDP terms, it almost got there with the British, like the 5th largest. So, so that's the economic aspect. But as I said earlier, it is not just any nation state. These are civilizational states. They have very distinctive cultures and histories. And if you look back in their histories, I've argued the piece I mentioned earlier about China. The Chinese version of communism was very different from what was being, practiced in Eastern Europe or in the Soviet Union. Similarly, Indian version of democracy is evolved in a certain Indian style. So I think there is something also happening beyond the digital revolution. Some people have argued, like there's a lot of talk about rise of Asia. Some people have argued that actually, if you go back a little bit in history, it's not rise, it's actually return of Asia. This argument is most convincingly articulated by Kishore Mahbubani, who is a former Singapore diplomat and now a professor in Singapore, who has argued that it's not something which has just happened. There's a whole history behind the domination of Asia in global economy. Until 18th century, 60% of the GDP of the world came from Asia. China and India were the 2 major players. And forecasts, now these are multiple sources, corporates, academic studies, World Bank, IMF, etc. The general consensus, this is obviously pre-COVID, so COVID has had a huge impact, but things it's still unfolding, so we don't know how it will map out finally. But by the end of this decade, China will be the largest economy, followed by India, US, and Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, etc. Europe is at the very end, and Germany, being the most important European economy, is in the top 10. Britain is out, France is out. So something interesting is in the making. A very good articulation of this argument is a book that came out a couple of years ago by Parag Khanna. I'm sure some of you are familiar with his work. He's also based in Singapore. As the title says, The Future is Asia. So let me just end with a few reflective points, looking ahead and what might be the issues. I've just set it very, very broadly and loosely, given the time constraints, but I think I've tried to make a convincing argument. Already, we are living in this age of Cold War II, if you like, because what happened with US and continues to, the bedeviled relations between the United States and more broadly the West and China also has a very strong digital dimension. This was the cover story a few years ago that economists did, the battle for digital discrimination. It's again this kind of binary. It's like if those of us who are old enough who remember the first Cold War, it was always, everything is Soviet Union versus Washington. And actually, we as a non-aligned country didn't quite fit in that bill, but that's how it was framed. And something similar is happening now. It's China versus the West, or China versus even the rest. But what happened last year and what continues to wreak havoc around the world, millions of people dead, economies destroyed, unemployment up, people back in poverty, etc., etc. There was a kind of talk before that. There's a new kind of globalization which has a Mandarin accent, which is Sino-globalization. I think that has got a certain, halt because of what happened and continue to happen with COVID. But COVID is very significant because if we think of 2008-9 economic crisis, which started in the United States, there was a lot of discussion around that time. People were suggesting that a certain version of globalization, an Anglo-globalization, if you like, had its course. We need to think afresh. And it's no coincidence that groups like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, they got together around that time. That we need to think of alternative structures. We can't just depend on the vagaries of American, insurance or house loans, etc. I think something similar is happening now. The churn is happening already with COVID, and my grandchildren would write about the pre-COVID and post-COVID world. It's one of those really interesting. And contemporaries are notoriously bad in observing their world. So I think the future generation will be interesting to see how that maps up. But certainly, the sign of globalization has had a setback. The issues that will continue to bedevil this global digital space, obviously the question of cyber sovereignty and data localization. We've seen that last year when there was a problem with border conflict between China and India, and the first thing India did was to ban TikTok. There's so much data. India had the largest market for TikTok. That's just one example. There's so many other applications which were banned. So this whole issue of cyber sovereignty is becoming increasingly important because China has very cleverly protected its cyberspace. But now, because its companies are going abroad, its attitude towards the data debate is changed because it doesn't want data localization. It wants data to be in its own control. Data is the new oil, as they say. Digital Cold War, AI and weaponization of information. Now, this is an area which is, I referred to earlier about, the WhatsApp University, but actually the weaponization of information, whether it is to manipulate elections or to contest wars, or, we've seen most recently in Afghanistan, that this organization, which is a declared terrorist organization by United Nations, takes over power, and they are using social media platforms which a former US president is denied access to. That's interesting, right? This issue is going to be very, very important. It's already extremely important, but as data grows and these systems become more sophisticated with AI, etc., it is likely that the weaponization will become more complicated. Digital for development. Just imagine for a moment how would have the poor in India, which is the largest chunk in the world, largest chunk of poor people live in our country. It used to be China's prerogative, but they got over that 20 years ago. So we have that, distinction of hosting most people in absolute poverty in the world. despite extraordinary changes, despite what I've been saying about all these amazing companies and what they're doing. Just imagine if there was no digital infrastructure in place and you had the pandemic. If there was no Aadhaar, if there was no JAM, Jan Dhan Yojana, Aadhaar and mobile, these infrastructures were created by the much maligned government, and not just this government, previous government. So there was an infrastructure in place, and therefore, despite the most serious crisis that India and the world has faced, there was no famine, there were no riots, right? So I think this idea of digitization and development is very important. And of course, the Chinese case is even more striking, because they have, last year they claimed publicly that they have basically eradicated extreme poverty. And I had the privilege to travel in rural China, and you don't see the poverty, kind of poverty that you see in the slums of Mumbai and Delhi, let alone rural India. My final point, which is related to what I said at the beginning of the slide, the idea of a certain version of globalization is changing, and COVID has pushed us to think in those terms. There's also talk of now deglobalization and revival of nationalism in all varieties, whether it is in Turkey or in China or in India or in Iran or in the US or Brexit in UK or Hungary. I can go on. But there's an interesting trend to sort of look inside. And this globalization, which dominated the discourse for 3 decades, is sort of coming to an end. It won't go away because the structures are so intertwined, economic structures especially. But I think it's a trend which might gain traction. Depends on how we deal with COVID. It's not gone yet. So on that note, I will stop, and happy to take questions or comments later. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for bringing in all that alarming data and emphasizing on the Asian perspective of how communication could change within these spaces in the coming years. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you.
Our second speaker for this evening is Ms. Kubashini Rama from South Africa. Ma'am has 25 years of experience working in non-governmental organizations and institutions of higher learning. In that time, her main focus has been on media communication, education, research, training, and gender. In her time at Gender Links from 2003 to 2014, Ma'am has contributed to the growing of the organization from 4 to 60 people with offices in 10 countries. Since then, Ma'am has spent time understanding, developing, monitoring, and evaluating systems that move beyond numbers to measuring change. She rejoined Gender Links in 2019 as an advisor and is now the executive director of Gender Links. Ma'am, it's our honor to have you. The session's all yours, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Mahadev. And thank you, Professor Thussu, because you set the stage very well for me. So, it's the way you've done it actually gives me a perfect springboard to move to where I need to go. So the first thing I want to say is just a brief word about Gender Links. Gender Links is a Southern African NGO working in 16 countries that constitute the Southern African Development Community. We were 15 and the Comores joined in 2020. So when we say we work in those countries, we do work in them. These are not just countries that we do sort of marginal work with. So we have offices in 10 countries and project sites in 5. We've just started work in the Comores, and this would be quite interesting. The Comores is going to be an interesting challenge because it's our first country where they have Sharia law as the main legal system. We've never had to deal with that before, so it's going to be an interesting time just understanding how the country works and how it might be different. So Professor Thussu made some very good points around the internet and its value and its power and how it's, changed the landscape completely around communication and the impact of COVID, etc. But I think fundamentally, there is something that these new communications trends do that is extremely concerning. If decontextualized, if we look at it as a product and as a trend, it's remarkable, it's powerful, it's amazing. But a very important question is the political economy. Who holds the power within these groupings? You spoke about Google and you spoke about market shares and how much of that they have, etc. But what is it that we actually do? So let's take, for example, we work in a very particular way. All our programming is evidence-based. So we conduct research, and on the basis of that research, we program. So our latest piece of research in the region for the media was a gender and media progress study, where we actually analyzed about 18,000 news items to determine a few things. So one of the things we wanted to know is who is speaking in the media. And it covered print, broadcast, online, the whole gamut of media. So only 21% of news sources were women out of 18,000 news items, which then means 79% were men. Globally, the Global Media Monitoring Project does a one-day monitoring, and it happened in September last year, 28th, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and India is part of that. A very interesting finding, it was 24%, and now this is the globe. So who speaks? Whose voices do we hear? And very important, what that means is whatever platform, whether it's online, whether it's whichever platform, who speaks sets the agenda. It may not tell me what I think about, I will determine what I think about it, but it certainly puts issues on my agenda. That is a very important consideration. So who's speaking? Whose voices are we hearing? Whose voices have power to make us think about what is on the agenda? Let me give you an example, a very concrete one. I'm not entirely sure how the vaccine rollout is, COVID-19 vaccine rollout is working in India. But in South Africa, of course, it makes sense to harness the internet, online tools to do the rollout. So every person who gets a vaccine has to be registered in an online database. Great system for tracking, but here's your challenge. And I believe that that's the route we should go. Without doubt, that is the route we should go. However, together with that route, we need some very serious strategies to address the digital divide. Like India, we have a very great disparity between our middle and lower classes, and poverty is a massive issue. So the digital divide is real. How are we going to get older women, older men, people who don't have access to the internet, smartphones, to then register? You cannot get the vaccine unless you're registered. So we're starting to speak about vaccine justice and vaccine apartheid, because clearly, again, what's starting to emerge are the differences. So the internet and its hold on communication comes with it a massive number of levels of inequity. And if we don't start to address those, we are carrying those inequities into the future in a very real way. Which leads me to my next point, which is around control. Who controls? Who controls the global media? Who controls the internet? And without doubt, I can say without fear of contradiction, that it's men, and to a large degree, white men. So it's not just a gender disaggregation, it's also race. You know, who's the capital, who's funding this, who's bankrolling it? And whether we like to believe it or not, the capital and the bankrollers also determine what goes into these media. So, you know, it's a very important consideration that if we just look at, you know, it's an amazing trajectory, the way the media has developed, how it's moved in now possibly the sixth wave. But what has it meant for fundamental human rights? And what has it meant for the existing gender and racial inequities that are there? It is not without its problems. And these have to be put in the forefront. The question of democracy and the use of digital technologies and communication and media in the project of democracy. Very, very important. I mean, there was much talk after the US election, you know, where Biden won and Kamala Harris, this is deputy, and Trump lost, was that in some ways, Trump's use of social media was what lost him the election. And with Obama, it was the opposite. Apparently, you know, Obama won the election on that strength. Again, it's whose hands are we putting the power in to make those decisions? Who is the electorate? And how much of that electorate has access to those digital communications? And it's a very important question. We in South Africa are moving towards our local government elections on the 1st of November. All of you may or may not have heard of recent events we've had around riots, unprecedented. So it's not going to be an easy time. How the social media space and the internet gets used to either help us get through this in a way that's positive and affirming, as opposed to violent and destructive, is going to be very important. Which is then leads to a very, very difficult question. But before we get there, I think I want to share a slide with you. One of the things that's emerged during, you know, the development of the social media, etc., is cyber misogyny. We have seen in all areas the emergence of cyber misogyny. And what has occurred is that the space is used to destroy particularly women journalists in this case, Ferial Haffajee, incredibly good journalist, but she obviously wrote an expose on government and then got attacked. I mean, in quite a disgusting way, if you look at that. And it happens. So that's just one example of how the space gets subverted. And, you know, how we need to be ever vigilant about controlling that space and ensuring that space actually is safe. So, you know, I think the point I'm making is perhaps best expressed here. You know, cyber misogyny is both a cause and it's a consequence of the stereotypes that pervade media houses, our societies. So, you know, it's a much bigger project that we have to work towards. Now, which leads me perhaps to the most important points I'd like to make. And at the risk of being attacked, but very, very important. Anything we do, where, you know, into the communication space, it has to be committed to dismantling injustice. And that's a belief I hold, and I'm not prepared to let go of. If the communication space is used, obviously the PR space might be slightly different, but certainly the journalist space, you know, the media space is about dismantling injustice and confronting it and challenging it. But of course, the biggest challenge in that space is regulation. How do you regulate the internet? How do you regulate social media? How do you regulate TikTok? I've seen, it terrifies me. I have a 10-year-old son who shows me the most incredibly, in some instances stupid, but in other instances damaging things on TikTok. And I shudder. It's like, how is this happening? And of course, he has access to it, and now we're regulating that very closely. Of course, the argument is always going to be freedom of expression. Surely in the name of freedom of expression, the internet must not be regulated in the same way we regulate most things. But the question is really, whose freedom of expression? Whose freedom of expression are we actually fighting for? Isn't the project to protect citizens and their right to security and safety and their own freedom of expression equally important? And in that regard, should we not be challenging this pervasive freedom that seems to be happening around all of our social media and internet, etc.? It's a difficult one. I will be the first to tell you that. We're facing very similar issues now around. It's quite interesting how COVID, and Professor Thussu, you also mentioned it, COVID's changed many things. One of the things I'm faced with as an employer now, is how do I enforce vaccination? Because those who are vaccinated are feeling vulnerable because some people have made the choice not to vaccinate. So how do you manage that? And I think for me, the critical thing in all of this is do no harm. And if we look at it in that way, these spaces, the communication trends in some ways run away from us and we catch up, we're always slightly behind. We need to control that space better because it's exacerbating the injustices and inequalities that already exist. So we've had some very interesting cases in South Africa around gender-based violence, where the space, Instagram, Facebook, etc., have been used to expose people in a very real way. This has impacted when the criminal cases go to court, because then the defendants' lawyers argue that they've already been tried and treated unfairly. Evidence is already in the public space and public sphere. There are processes that have to happen legally and in the court system. And we've already got all of it out there. So we've compromised the justice system before the case has even reached it. So there are these kinds of things that are emerging. And I think it's critical that we sit down and say, this is an amazing space. I mean, I use the internet for everything. It was our savior during COVID. However, within the context that we live in, and I mean, China being a case in point, which is incredible and moved forward, but which one of us can sit here and say with a great degree of confidence that China is one of the most democratic states in the world? I don't think any of us can say that with any level of confidence. And how, so when we look at this, the development and trends in communication, it has to be contextual. It has to be within the broader project of democratization and addressing injustices, and in my particular passion, gender inequalities. And so much of that has to do with control, who speaks, and what we're speaking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. With this webinar currently being watched live by more than 250 plus delegates, your talk on how communication is a powerful trend or monopoly, and how interestingly it's also gendered, and how dismantling injustice is the need of the hour, was really, really useful. Thank you so much. Our last speaker for this evening is Dr. Laxman Pant. Sir is a chairperson of Media Action Nepal, a well-known media researcher, journalist, freedom of expression advocate, media trainer, and a university teacher who holds extensive knowledge in the areas of media rights, freedom of expression, and media development. He started his career as a radio journalist 2 decades ago and worked with numerous media institutions in different capacities, ranging from a reporter to an editor. At the Kathmandu University in Nepal and Dhaka University in Bangladesh, Sir has contributed to the formulation of media and communication policies, strategies, and the promotion of freedom of expression at the national and international levels. Sir is currently the chairperson of Media Action Nepal and a senior special correspondent at Television Today. He is also one of the authors of the study supporting safety of journalists in Nepal, an assessment based on UNESCO's journalist safety indicators, published in 2016 by UNESCO Paris. Sir, everyone is waiting to listen to your perspective on the mega trends in communication. The session's all yours.
Thank you very much. It was honor to listen to distinguished speakers, Professor Daya, Thussu, and Madam Rama, on different perspectives that touch upon the issues of mega trends at the moment, touching on communications and media. We studied the book contributed by Professor Daya Thussu during our master's degree course here in Nepal. I was among one of the first batch students doing their master's in Nepal. That was on international communication, and it is my honor to see him sharing the same digital space here. Your presentation was enlightening in the sense that you touched on so many interesting issues, ending up with the role of digital platforms for development. Also, Madam Rama, the observation of the media role, especially dismantling injustices that exist in our societies in different forms. I'm endorsing and seconding all your thoughts, but I would not repeat what you have shared in this discussion that is being joined by many people around this region. I must say South Asia and beyond. We were unable to join this conclave in person, and this is one of the reasons that is, one of the mega trends recently set up by the current state of COVID-19 pandemic, that we are compelled to communicate in the digital platforms. I have a few observations on how communications and media platforms going ahead in Nepal, in South Asia, and currently I'm engaged in one of a very important research studies that we are analyzing the sustainability and business viability of media in Southeast Asia, where we are doing a research. I'm one of the co-leaders of that research that is being commissioned by UNESCO and Public Media Alliance. So I will also touch upon the observations that we noticed in this region. Some of the observations that have come around from the current state of pandemic. So I would like to start with my observation about the crisis of professionalism, the crisis of credibility. I'm not going to touch on all issues that are entirely related to the communications, but rather I would focus on how media power, the media's watchdog role has been weakened in my observation, not only here in Nepal, but across South Asian countries and in some extent Southeast Asian countries as well. There is question about professionalism, media credibility, because media now seem to have compromised with the power centers in the pretext of business loss alongside the COVID-19 pandemic. If we refer to the case of Nepal, many media houses, especially that of the mainstream media houses or corporate media houses, they have compelled journalists to quit their newsrooms. And that is some other way, media people are also divided into political lines. That is a very big problem that Nepal currently faces. And I believe that many countries in this region, South Asia, are also facing the same problem, that media is either interested, or I would like to say they are compelled to serve the power centers in the pretext of business loss. Political dominance is there, that media is serving power centers. There is also, problem with the credibility issues, disinformation, infodemic, alongside the pandemic. Many businesses shut down, but media people, especially those of the business houses, they are taking this as granted, and taking this as an opportunity to bargain with the power centers. That I consider a biggest challenge for making media more professional around. However, pandemic restricted the interactions in the physical world, not only here in Nepal, but beyond this country and South Asia. But still, communication technology elsewhere remains a prototypical tool, keeping society floating in the COVID-19 pandemic. This is one example that we are communicating through these platforms. But there are also issues on the privacy and security, especially that of the cybersecurity issues. Nepal is currently going through legal reforms because we have now entered to a federal context, the political changes. It's already been 4 to 5 years that there are newly elected governments at the local level and province level. And they have started reforming the laws. But a debate has also been started alongside their reforms, because in many contexts, the lawmakers at the federal level and at the province level have not taken very well care of their commitments to the Constitution of Nepal and to the international, human rights treaties that Nepal is a state party to, especially that of the ICCPR, right to information, freedom of expression. So these are some of the burning issues that we notice here in Nepal at the moment. Also, there is increased dissatisfaction from the public. When we talk about the digital spaces here in Nepal, there are over 100 million, social media sites, only that of the Facebook, but also if we look into the data from telecommunications authorities, the number is growing every day. And there is increasing dissatisfaction over digital platforms about business losses, economy, employment issues, and people are unable to distinguish between how media contents would shock to the public, and also at the same time, there is a flood of disinformation and misinformation over media outlets. A few months ago, actually in January 2021, we released a research studying 52,000 news stories of the corporate media house, 10 daily newspapers and 10 online portals. And we have seen around that many of the news stories by and large, Nepali media seem to have disseminating stories on the basis of fact, but there are questions about their sources. We can see at this moment the current unrest in Afghanistan after Taliban's takeover. We have seen a lot of stories, baseless stories, and we have also seen these stories not one at this context in Afghanistan, but during the time of political tensions between neighbors. A few years ago's observation, if I have to highlight, is that of some border issues that have mutually been settled out between countries, but media especially in this Indian say TV channels that exaggerated the issues, and that some other way disturb the relationship between people of India and Nepal. With these observations, what I'm trying to say that a lot of changes are taking place, but watchdog role of media is in question, because there is a heavy division between among the journalists. Journalists now tend to serve the political forces. Any time in the history of Nepal, and we can visibly see in the surrounding countries, especially India, the media's content has been questioned, their credibility has been questioned, because media either tend to serve the political interest or to the business interest alongside the current impact of COVID-19. Also, elections across the world, or I would say in this region, if we have to observe the future challenge for media observations, that another chance for misinformation and disinformation, that there may be some opportunities for political leaders to use some tactics, and including, as Professor Thussu observing that of the artificial intelligence technologies, that I also suspect that the political powers and business houses would use these technologies to distort information, and media could be used as the weapon for them to overthrow the platform defenses. Also, ethical crisis, not only in the exercise of journalistic content in this region, or at least say in Nepal, but also on side of the social media platform users. So governments in the region, what I see in South Asia and Southeast Asia, by and large, have not distinguished the way freedom of expression and the journalistic content be disseminated among the people. I think there are many legal reforms going on in this region, these two regions especially, but these reforms are not compatible to member states' commitment to international treaties and their own commitments to their own constitutions. And the media outlets that suffered a lot at this moment are that of the non-profit media outlets, the community-based media outlets. And that has resulted to the increasing trend of discrimination when it comes to the coverage of, coverage of the diversity issues in Nepali media. There is discrimination institutionalized in the newsrooms as news sources are heavily dependent upon some manufactured consent. So that is one issue that I think in coming decades, the media and communication platforms have to deal with. And due to the highly political divisions of and business divisions, the protection of good interest of journalism that we have been discussing through the at least 1 or 2 decades in our context has been questioned. The issue of self-regulation is there, and journalists in some contexts are asked to be self-regulated. But we have almost all countries in this region, South Asia region, have media or press councils, and they have their own code of conduct, journalist code of conduct. They are known to that, but there is again question whether journalists do respect these code of conduct or not. In countries like Nepal, that we're going through a post-conflict management issues, it still remain some problems. For example, impunity. Many journalists were killed during conflict of the 10 years long conflict between the then state governments and the Maoists, who are now part of this state system. Many journalists, 40 plus journalists have been killed or disappeared, and hardly 2 to 3 cases have been sorted out. We do have some mechanisms called say, transitional justice system. There are some commissions looking after this, but there is no solutions to that. And that is the reason why international community, especially the Secretary General's report or UNESCO Director General's call to the government of Nepal every year, reminding authorities to address the issue of impunity. And this impunity not being addressed has greater impact in a negative sense to independent journalism. We have seen some part of Nepal that journalists have been censoring themselves, and also discrimination institutionalized in Nepali media, in the sense that we have roughly 25,000 journalists working with about 700 plus radio stations and around 50 TV channels currently in operations, and thousands of newspapers, and around 3,000 news portals that are legally registered with the authorities, and huge number of journalists, but their safety in relations to professionalism, safety in relations during the time of crisis. Around 1,000 journalists have left their job, and those leaving their professions belong to corporate media house, not that were not a smaller house or community media kind of things. So this is time, not only for Nepal, all countries, at least in South Asia, to rethink about the business modality, who should invest in media, and who to be a journalist. If we really want to reflect the society, the diversity in content, that of the gender, that of language, that of other diversities that exist in societies in several forms, I think we should start rethink about the reorienting about journalism itself, also the investment. There's some investment to Nepali media that come from the international arena in some forms. But when it comes to the protection issues, there are no protective measures taken place by media houses. That is one thing. Second, that in last 1 decade, what we have seen, there is huge growth in the academic institutions offering journalism and media courses, many universities offering these courses, but journalism course has not been mainstreamed or at least promoted by the corporate media houses. It is open to everyone. Anyone can be a journalist overnight. There are freedom of expression issues, of course, but freedom of expression, journalism is one of the platforms for advocating free speech. But alongside, we have been advocating for long, and there has been huge investment in the academic sectors and trainings and capacity building of journalists. Now, I think time has come to see. I'm not in favor of controlling the speech in any forms, but I think we should start discussing about regulating the issues that has often been confronting the idea of credibility, meaning we should check who should invest in media. There is black money coming to the media, and there are issues of press freedom, and credibility has been in question for so many years here in Nepal. So that is making media professional and making investment transparent. That would answer these all questions, and some other were addressed to the issue of credibility crisis. Third thing, Nepal has 130 plus languages spoken, and it's a diverse country, but the reflection of media content when it comes to, say, for example, gender mainstreaming. I had an opportunity to contribute to a chapter for IGI Global research last year, and during that time I observed I interacted with 100 plus journalists, of which 75 plus journalists were women. What we have seen here in Nepal, that corporate media houses are not transparent enough for assigning media. And till that, it's 100 plus history of active journalism here in Nepal through different ages. What we have seen that, corporate newsrooms and corporate media houses are reluctant to the professional issues, and they are not providing opportunity to the markets. There are no free competition. There are no healthy competition among who should they pick as editors. And it is a kind of discrimination institutionalized in newsrooms, and that is resulting to a kind of injustice in Nepali society in relation to gender mainstreaming. That is one issue. Finally, a sustainability issue is in question now. The observations from our study that I am leading for Southeast Asian countries, which we are expecting to be public by this year, by the end of December, what we have seen. And also we have a series of discussions, the Media Action Nepal, the media rights organization I lead, we have discussed about many issues 2 months ago, virtually, reaching out to authorities of all provinces, including ministers who look after communications and media issues and technology issues. What we have seen that the sustainability issue is not appropriately understood by the authorities. When it comes to the issue of sustainability media, state authorities would start, providing some monetary supports to the media, and in return they would expect that media outlets would shop them. So this is the right time to discuss and to engage in dialogues. This may be a problem in surrounding countries, our neighboring countries. I very often observe the content that is being served by the media of India, Bangladesh, in some context, Sri Lanka as well. In a few weeks' time, we are organizing, coming week, we have a South Asia level training for journalists of 5 countries, which Media Action Nepal is one of the stakeholders. What we are expecting that the issue of sustainability should be redefined. So sustaining media in a long run, but reducing the state dependency. That would make the media more powerful. Media becoming more powerful means balancing the power of state organs in democratic societies, that of the judiciary, executive, and legislatures. That's why media has been known as the fourth estate. So these are some of the emerging issues alongside COVID-19 pandemic. I think this gives some reflections to participants of this virtual plus in-person listeners to rethink in coming at least say 1 decade. And due to the time constraint, I'm not going to elaborate more issues here. I would like to thank the organizer, PRCI, Professor Ravi, and all organizing committee members for this opportunity to share my observations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for enlightening us with your talk on media and how crisis of professionalism, media credibility, and the power of media from the Nepal and the Southeast Asian perspective. Thank you so much, sir, again. So this brings us to the end of the session today. It was indeed a plethora of ideas and perspectives that were put forward by all our eminent speakers, and has opened new areas of thought in our minds. A big thank you to all our esteemed speakers again. We are now open to a brief question and answer session. I think we have one question already. This question is to all the speakers from Aparna Ranjan. She's asking if freedom of press, is it a myth or reality? So any one of you can take the question.
Shall I?
Yes,
Shall
sir.
I respond?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes, it depends. It depends, but it depends the political polarizations, especially that of the political systems of countries. So, if you live in a country where democracy in a real sense is being exercised by all groups, all diversities, freedom of press could be a reality. But even autocratic nations or say the regimes, they would in the public face with the advent of these all digital platforms would come to say that they respect freedom of press. We have seen here in Nepal, because we have been going through many political transitions and changes. The advocates of autocratic regime would be so happy to claim themselves that they respect press freedom. But for them and for the practitioners, it could be myth. So it depends on a society where we live in and how the idea of press freedom is being discussed and understood. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Professor Daya Thussu. Sir, can you also share your perspective on the same?
Thank you. Well, Mr. Pant has already covered some of the ground that I was going to cover in this answer. I would just say that, there are different types of media systems around the world. Even in the so-called Western world, you have a very distinct approaches. So in Western Europe, you have a good tradition of public service broadcasting. So television news is even today on the BBC, there are no advertisements on BBC radio, television, online, right? So there's a whole generation of people growing up without having to be exposed to advertising, as against the American system, which is always been commercial, totally commercially driven. And that model where news and information is also a certain, the freedom of expression, the freedom to actually, not to put us too fine a point on it, to basically make money and raise the influence. And Mr. Pant and before that, Ms. Rama also mentioned in terms of the ownership and how that matters, who controls the discourse. And so these are fundamental problems. And so it varies. The thing is, having lived in China, you can't compare. So kind of stuff that gets only published in China is obviously totally monitored, controlled. It's not journalism. It's like public relations for the party. But in more, even in despite what Mr. Pant was saying, even today in a very sort of defiled and degraded journalism in South Asia, you still have a certain variety of discourse. It's not just everybody is saying the same thing. So I think it varies from the context of which. So in other words, it's essentially talking about the political system within which the media operate. And I think that's something we should keep in mind. But freedom of expression is fundamental in democracies. It's enshrined in our constitutions and in our culture. I mean, people disagree, and that's perfectly okay.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am, would you like to add something to what sir said?
I think that the fundamental issue is the fourth estate, the media being the fourth estate, and somehow above and beyond the rights that the rest of us enjoy. I'm a former journalist and an educator as well. So, how we balance everyone's rights is, I think, the critical sort of at the level of discussing rights and abstractions and power. Whose rights are most important? How do we balance those? How do we interpret it? We've had particular discussions in South Africa currently around a hate speech bill, and that is about to be promulgated into law. And one of the journalists who wrote an op-ed was actually found, his comments were found to be unconstitutional because he wrote an op-ed around the fact that gay people should be compared to dogs. And it was published. And it created massive discussion around freedom of expression because and there have to be limits. An editor cannot be allowed to say those things about other human beings fundamentally and infringing on their rights. So I don't think it's never an easy path, it's never an easy terrain, but I think one that has to be constantly engaged with.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. And due to lack of time, I will take one more question. We have a lot of them coming in, but this question is from Rashmi Bhumi Reddy. She asks, why freedom of speech and expression is given restriction in India? Government tries to oppress the press when press goes against the government, but press is pointing on loopholes in the government administration and the government tries to restrict it. So what is your opinion? Yes,
Can I go?
Yes,
Can I
sir.
go first?
Yes, sir.
Okay. As Ms. Rama mentioned, in a democracy, the role of the press is very well defined. It is the fourth state. Is supposed to be, putting authorities in a difficult situation, asking them questions when they fail to deliver. But that's the kind of normative position. In real world, as has been pointed out already, there are very clear partisan interests. This could be political, there could be corporate, there could be hate mongers, whatever. And that trend has actually increased quite substantially in the digital age because this the gatekeeping role has disappeared, and anybody can be a journalist with a smartphone. So I think the relationship in the traditional, fourth state and the other three states has changed. It is a much more chaotic and very disruptive system where all kinds of people are involved, and it is, so somebody mentioned about regulation. I mean, this is something which is of fundamental importance because in the absence of that, so for especially in the digital space, there isn't a very well-defined system in place in any country that I know of. EU is doing some interesting stuff, but by and large, so it's either total control, like in authoritarian systems, or you have a very ambivalent sort of, because it's a leaky system. It isn't in place. And I think also governments, there are certain things that just irrespective of the nature of the government, they have to, have some systems in place to make sure that the discourse is within a acceptable level. So in that sense, some kind of, adversarial relation is fine, but when you cross the line, there has to be some regulation, some law which will control that. And I think this relationship between the fourth state and the government has been quite complicated one. But I think also, as I said earlier, the kind of partisan nature of current communication environment and journalism specifically is changing all that. And as a journalism professor, I sometimes feel very concerned about the future journalists we are producing, because journalism as a profession has profoundly changed. Arguably, the most important media company today is not a conventional media company. It probably is Google, because it decides what gets on the top 10 searches. So the whole media ecology has changed, and I think all these issues have to be somehow discussed in that. It sounds very macro and very kind of but actually you can't avoid that in today's interconnected world.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am, sir, if you would like to add anything.
Well, it's not only in India, elsewhere across the world, authorities would try to restrict free speech when you go against them. That is a very fundamental nature of the authorities, and sometimes even democratic governments would try to do that. But we have to check whether the states have restrictions by law or practice. That matters a lot, I think. And yes, there are attempts by governments, at least I know, on part of the India or here in Nepal, and that is the reason why government in some context would favor to see partisan journalism, and there is a heavy division between journalists. You would hardly find a journalist who does not carry membership of a political party. At least here in Nepal, I can say you will hardly, and same is the case in India. That is one reason why restrictions somewhere imposed over media. But yes, we have to check whether the essence of democracy that states claim to be democratic has been ensured both through the legislations and its implementation. That is the big question.
If I may add just very briefly,
Yes.
I think we need to be very careful to simplify this extremely complex terrain. I think Professor Thussu puts it very clear. The whole terrain has changed, but it also, in the absence of government regulation, to assume that there is no self-regulation or self-censorship is a myth, because the media serves some interest. It's highly unlikely that a media house, and there are one or two that don't serve any interests. So in the absence of government interests, sometimes it will be big business. There are many different interests, and that terrain is so complicated and requires engagement, requires dismantling and reconstitution. So for example, when we do election monitoring, and you'll find that despite the fact that in a country like South Africa that has 46% women in its parliament, even in that space, women are hardly heard. What is the excuse in that space? You have 46%, almost 50% women who can speak on every subject. So it's regulation is not a simple case of governance, of rules and laws. It's even in the absence of written regulations. How do we self-censor? And what drives that?
Thank you, ma'am. And thank you to all the speakers for so patiently taking the questions. Now, I would like to request our chair of the session, Professor B.K. Ravi, to conclude the session with his presidential remarks.
So I think this was one of the very informative and thought-provoking sessions. All the three speakers, I think, they did justice to the subject, and questions also raised. How the changing scenario
So there's some disturbance with the audio, sir. Prashant?
Ma'am, just give 1 minute. I'm just fixing it.
Am I audible now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, there's some internet issues. So it was a really an excellent presentation by all the. It is high time we have to redefine some of these very important concepts, because whenever we have new trends, new concepts, emerging media, especially in a country like India and in other situations, field of media education also needs to equip ourselves changing scenario of media education, especially in a country like India, that needs to be done. So again, once again, thank you very much, and once again, I think there were quite a lot of more than 500, 600 had registered for our event, and it's a live event which is going on, the global conclave, and quite a lot of delegates are listening to all of us. Once again, I thank all the guest speakers for their excellent presentation and for attending this webinar. Thank you very much. And we request you again, we are planning to organize one more on the future of media education. I request all of you to join us again. Thank you very much again on behalf of Public Relations Council of India. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Thank you, sir, in spite of all those technical glitches, for putting together the takeaways of the session. So beautiful. Thank you again. As this session has come to an end, there are a lot of people we need to thank. So once again, I will take this opportunity to deliver the word of thanks. The 15th Global Communication Conclave, an international webinar on communication in the new decade, mapping the megatrends, began with the motive to put forward new emerging areas in communication and communication studies. It has definitely been 2 great days of sharing and learning together. This initiative would definitely not have been possible without the efforts of a lot of people who have worked tirelessly to put together this amazing conclave. Firstly, understanding megatrends in communication would not have been possible without such wonderful speakers, Dr. Daya Thussu, Ms. Kubashini Rama, and Dr. Laxman Pant. I thank all of you once again for taking your time off and being with us here today and throwing light on how communication is changing so quickly and why it is more and more important for us to keep up with these changing scenarios for a better and a more effective communication and learning. A big thank you to all of you all once again. I would like to extend my gratitude to our chairperson for the session this evening, Dr. B.K. Ravi, without whose support we could not have progressed through the session so smoothly. Thank you, sir. Like someone has rightly said, it is not the beauty of the building you should look at, it is the construction of the foundation that will stand the test of time. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. M.B. Jairam, Chairman Emeritus and Chief Mentor of PRCI, Mr. B. Srinivas Murthy, Chairman Global Conclave, Ms. Geeta Shankar, Director YCC Board, Mr. Biswajit Das, Secretary General of WCC, and Dr. T. Vinay Kumar, National President of PRCI. Without all your constant support and efforts, this global conclave would not have turned out so wonderfully the way it has. Thank you all for putting together this wonderful initiative. Also, a big thank you to Mr. Pashupati from the Mangalore chapter, PRCI, and his team for the wonderful support throughout the webinar, and Mr. Yuraj for all the design and all the members of the coordination, curation, and the backend team. The vote of thanks today would be incomplete without thanking the technical team. Without them, our virtual existence wouldn't be possible. So thank you, Dr. Prashant, for tirelessly working to make sure all the sessions carry out smoothly without any technical glitches. Lastly, a big round of thank you to all the participants, office bearers of PRCI, members of the media and PR professionals, academicians, researchers, students, and all the attendees from different parts of the country and the world who have logged in virtually, and also to those who have made it physically to this event and supported our endeavor in educating and encouraging this emerging area of communication. I thank every single person today for joining us. Hope you all had a great session filled with a lot of new learning. Thank you all once again, and hope you all had a great evening. This is Vasundhara signing off until we meet again next year at another global conclave. Stay healthy, stay safe, and see you all next year.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Laxman. Thank you,
Thank you.
Madam. Thank you very much. Thank you. Very grateful to you.